Hey guys, this is Jessica, and Noam here for another episode of What's That Sound, and today we're exploring the drum sound you hear in Golden Hour by Kacey Musgraves.
The drummer was Ian Fitchuck. He produced it with Daniel Tashian. The mixing engineer was Sean Everett. It is bananas how they got this sound. The master bus chain is like 20 plugins long. It sounds super punchy. We're gonna figure it out.
For our drums today, we have our Ludwig Vista Lite kick drum, our Ludwig Supralite snare, and we had the Gretsch toms and Zildjian K Dark hi-hats. To get the really warm, dry sound we were going for, we put a big fat snare drum layered with a big fat snare drum ring and then a big fat snare drum tortilla folded into a quarter size, all on our snare to really dampen it. And we also had a lot of dampening on our toms. And then actually in our hi-hat, we used some of the fabric cloth that is on top of it and also inside of it to really suck out those high ends that we were getting.
When we're digging into Golden Hour by Kacey Musgraves, this record is really peculiar in that it feels really, really natural, and it's not at all. This is a ultra compressed drum sound. It is an ultra processed drum sound. It is nowhere near natural, and yet the record has a natural feel to it. Part of this is just artistry, right? Part of this is just processing things in a way that's tasteful, that feels instinctual, feels organic, even though like you're processing it heavily. It's like it's always on this very razor thin line that if you go over it, it feels unnatural, and they just really, really stay within it. Part of it is that rather than processing elements individually, they are opting for processing the entire mix as a whole really heavily. There's a bunch of information online about how they recorded this, how they mixed it. Sean Everett has been really, really generous with how much information he gave about this stuff. The overwhelming takeaway from this stuff is how many things he has on his mix bus. There's like 20 plugins going on the mix bus, which that from someone who's not doing that seems like a crazy thing to do. The way that you have to think about it is that you're making yourself a canvas to paint on, right? You're making yourself a world to live in. And that canvas is not it's not Microsoft Paint. It's not this perfectly clean canvas with nothing on it. It has a ton of texture already baked into it. It has a ton of lighting baked into it. It has all these things that are really, really shaping before you even put any paint on it. It's really, really shaped the way that it sounds. And that's the way that we approach this drum sound. So there's very little processing on the individual elements, and there's nothing terribly spectacular about the way we recorded it. It's all about the way that we processed it, and we almost exclusively processed the whole thing together. So for the miking on this, we kept it pretty simple, pretty standard. On kick drum, we had a kick in mic that is a D12. That's a really not too big kick drum mic, not too bright, it's kind of vintage feeling. On the kick out, we had a Sound Deluxe iFet, which is a FET47 clone. It is enormous sounding and kind of captures all the body. On the snare top and bottom, we had 57s, super simple. On the toms, we had 414s. On the overheads, we had Bill Bradley's recreation of some C12s, super well-rounded microphones, big, bright, but also with a really accurate image of what the drums sound like. We put up some room mics as well, which are Coles 4038s, really dark, not too many excessive cymbal noises in them. And then we put up two kind of wild card microphones. Another room mic that was a 47, and that was darkened pretty substantially, and it was immensely compressed with an 1176. That was just like an energy microphone to just like give a bunch of extra length to things and a bunch of extra energy. And then we had one kind of odd mic, which was a microphone just in the middle of the kit, kind of equidistant from the toms, the kick drum, the snare drum. And that was a 421. It was facing right at the side of the snare, basically. And this was something that we were mostly just using for some extra tone on the kick drum. The kick drum kind of gets a unique tone when you mic it from there. And we also use that to trigger some spring reverb, just to give a little extra ambience around the drum kit as a whole. So the plug-in chain on both the mix bus and on the drum bus is completely like deranged on this, right? It is a lot of crazy choices. And to be honest, there's a little bit of a sense of recklessness to the way that it's done. But it's all done kind of with some reasoning behind it and with taste. There's lots and lots of EQs put on this stuff. The reason that it's not just one EQ is that each EQ is kind of playing to its strength. There is different EQs that do different gestures that just do them really, really well. We're using a bunch of API EQs, which API EQs are unique in that when you push further and further in terms of gain, it also tightens up the cue. So the frequencies that you're affecting gets more and more focused as you push it, and so it really does a great job of like making certain frequencies pop out and become very transient and focused in a drum set. So we're pushing a bunch of frequencies with API EQs. We're doing a very particular thing with Pultec. On a Pultec, you have 2 bands in the low frequencies and you have 2 bands in the high frequencies. And they are voiced slightly apart, the low frequencies, and the high frequencies, you can select them independently. One of them is a bell, one of them is a shelf. We are boosting low frequencies in the Pultec, and then we are cutting low frequencies as well. We've talked about this in a few different videos, but basically what that does is it boosts all this low end and then scoops some of the low end just above that, right? Scoops what you could call the like lower mids, gets a little bit scooped out. So it kind of refocuses where the kick drum is voiced. It refocuses a little bit of where the snare drum is voiced. It takes care of a little bit of mud while adding a lot of like really, really rich low end. In the high end, we're doing a very similar concept. We're pushing a ton of 8K. With a kind of narrow Q, right? We're pushing a lot of 8K with our bell, and then with the shelf, we are cutting a bunch of 20. And that 20 is with a really broad Q, right? So it ends up affecting frequencies way lower than 20. The result is we end up with something that is very softened in the high end and still feels immensely bright, right? It is still very, very bright. But what we're calling bright, it can mean many different frequencies. And in this case, we're leaning off of a bunch of our, 20 kilohertz stuff, 15 kilohertz stuff, and we're leaning into more of our 8K range, 10K range, just to make it feel a little bit more vintage. There's one other very particular move that we're doing, which is we are cutting a bunch of 60 hertz and we're adding a bunch of 30 hertz. Again, this is a similar concept. We are revoicing where the low end is sitting, right? The fundamental of the kick drum is probably somewhere around 60 hertz, but there's all these subharmonics that are reaching 30 hertz, and we want those to come out. And so rather than just adding the 30, which might get a little overwhelming, we're also cutting some of the 60 so that it lets those 30 hertz frequencies really speak. In terms of compression, on any of the direct mics and any of the overheads, we're not doing any compression. All that we're doing is compressing the drum set as a whole. Now, this compression, we're not really doing much in terms of traditional compression. What we're doing is a few things. We're using multiband compression and we're using multiband expansion. The multiband expansion is a matter of making certain frequencies only pop out when they need to. It's a really great way to control certain frequencies in a mix that can get really overwhelming and can take up too much energy. Low-end frequencies can do this, right? If you have this really long kick drum that has all this sub-information and you're just letting it fly, it's going to eat up a lot of energy, and it's also going to take away from the dynamic nature of that frequency range. If you have low end constantly in your mix, there's no dynamics there, right? There isn't any dynamic impact because you're hearing it all the time, right? If you withhold some of that low end and then pop it in every time the kick drum hits, all of a sudden that low end becomes so much more impactful because there's contrast in it. So we have an expander on the low end. That expander is set to pull everything down by, let's say, 6 decibels. And every time the kick drum gets above a certain threshold, everything in that frequency range gets expanded to 0, basically. So every time the kick drum's not hitting, all of the low end of the drum set is down 6 decibels. And every time the kick drum hits, all of a sudden you get that low end up to full range. And we also have our release knob on that expander. So we can decide exactly how long that low end lasts within the kick drum based on how we set that release time. We're doing a very similar thing in the high end. Everything between like 5K and like 15K, we have an expansion going on that is set with a bass level down 6 decibels. So every time that snare drum is not hitting, all of that high end is kind of scooped, right? It's subdued, and every time the snare drum hits that high end, it triggers the expander, it pops that high end out for a split second. We are tuning that second with our release time, and then the expander pulls it back down. The result is it's this very buoyant mix, right, where there is all these frequencies bouncing around, and you don't have this overwhelming sound of constant high end, constant low end. Everything kind of has a rhythm to it that's working with the drum kit. So the other thing that we're doing in terms of compression is our multiband compression. Now, we have multiple multiband compressors and multiband limiters going on in this mix. We are using a PSP Vintage Warmer as our main multiband compressor. Now, this is a kind of point and shoot compressor in that you can't like control the individual bands separately. You just flip the multiband switch and all of a sudden you're working in a multiband setting. And we are both using one as just a multiband compressor, and we're also using one in brick wall mode that's essentially a multiband limiter. The result is that we have something that we are mixing into that is causing a wall, right? That frequencies cannot get louder than a certain range, right? And instead of getting louder, they just get more compressed. Now, this is done in frequency-specific ranges, right? So if you get a sudden surge of low end, it's not going to necessarily affect the compression of the high end. It's just going to compress that low end. This is a really, really powerful tool. This is a really dangerous tool as well. It's really, really easy to mess up your mix with this. If you were to just take this plugin and put it on at the end of the mix, it would alter the sound of things so dramatically that it's kind of going to be unusable most of the time, right? There's very rare instances where I have put this on at the end of a mix and found that it made it sound better. The way that I always use this is it's on right at the beginning. You know, it's on probably an hour into mixing, I turn it on, and then all of my decisions are made with the result in mind, not with what happens before that compressor in mind. Meaning, if I add low end to my kick drum, I'm probably adding a lot more low end than I normally would because a bunch of that low end gets eaten up by the multiband compression, right? I might be altering the high frequency stuff that I'm doing. Everything that you're doing is getting dramatically altered by all of this multiband stuff. And as long as you're living in that world the whole time, you still can control things really heavily. And the result is you end up with a completely modern maximized mix. You end up with something that without multiband compression, you would never be able to get a mix this loud. You would never be able to get certain frequencies this present. You would never be able to get all of these things mashed in together in a way that feels musical. All of these things that feel superhuman, it's all by working into a multiband compressor the entire time. Somehow, I have even more things to talk about on this mix bus. This mix bus is so long. We have a ton of tape emulators on this mix bus. We have a Studer A800. That is a relatively clean sounding tape machine, but it does some interesting stuff with the stereo field. It kind of makes things feel a bit decoupled left from right because there's little differences between the two, and it kind of opens that up. It also, on the settings that we have, it's adding a lot of low end. We have our Ampex that is also just kind of giving a lot of color and giving some saturation. We have multiple copies of Satin going on, which is, again, just a general tape emulator. We're doing a really weird thing with Satin, which is we are pushing the azimuth. Azimuth was a control that is for tape machines. It's essentially the angle of the tape heads. And when you have it set incorrectly, it ducks a bunch of high frequencies in weird ways, and it causes weird phase issues going on left to right. They are using this to their advantage. They're using this in a musical way. It's a really, really weird move, but it sounds pretty incredible when it's used right. that was how we got Golden Hour by Kacey Musgraves.
Thanks for watching, and as always, please let us know in the comments what other sounds you'd like to hear us break down, and we'll see you next time.